This video takes you deep into the oceans to uncover mysteries that have puzzled humanity for centuries. From the strange Baltic Sea anomaly to the massive underwater structures of the Yonaguni monument, we explore discoveries that challenge what we know about ancient history. Sunken cities like Heracleon and Pavlopetri reveal lost civilizations beneath the waves, while the Antikythera mechanism hints at technology far ahead of its time. The Black Sea Deluge and the Bimini Road raise questions about ancient floods and the legend of Atlantis. Alongside these, the mysterious disappearances of the USS Cyclops and USS Scorpion expose the ocean's darker side. Together, these chapters reveal a hidden world beneath the sea, where history, science, and mystery collide. Chapter 1. The Baltic Sea Anomaly. In the summer of 2011, the Baltic Sea was calm in a way that often hides its history. The water between Sweden and Finland has carried trade ships, war fleets, and fishing boats for centuries. Beneath that quiet surface lies one of the most surveyed seabeds in the world, filled with known wrecks from medieval times to modern wars. It was not a place where anyone expected a new deep-sea mystery to appear. The discovery began not with archaeologists, but with a small Swedish team called Ocean X. They were not searching for ancient ruins or lost underwater cities. Their goal was far more practical. They were using side-scan sonar to locate shipwrecks that could be of historical or commercial interest. The team included experienced divers and engineers, led by Peter Lindberg, who had spent years mapping the Baltic seafloor. On June 10, 2011, their sonar screen showed something unusual. At a depth of roughly 87 meters, the sonar image revealed a large circular object unlike anything they had seen before. It appeared to be about 60 meters across, with a raised center and what looked like straight edges. In a region known mostly for flat sediment and scattered rocks, the shape stood out immediately. At first, the team assumed it might be a known wreck or a strange cluster of stones. The Baltic Sea is full of surprises, but most have clear explanations. As they adjusted the sonar angle and passed over the site again, the image remained consistent. The object was solid. It cast a shadow. It rose clearly above the surrounding seafloor. This moment marked the beginning of what would become one of the most talked about unexplained ruins in modern underwater archaeology, even though no one involved used that phrase at the time. The Ocean X team marked the coordinates and continued scanning. What they found next added another layer to the mystery. Roughly 200 meters away from the circular object, the sonar picked up a long, straight feature on the seabed. It looked like a trail or path leading toward the object. On sonar, it appeared lighter than the surrounding sediment, as if something had scraped or disturbed the seafloor. This detail would later become one of the most debated aspects of the discovery. When the team returned to port and reviewed the data, they realized the find did not match any known wreck in maritime records. The shape was wrong. The size was unusual, and there were no signs of typical ship debris around it, no scattered timbers, no metal fragments, no anchors. Word of the discovery spread quickly once Ocean X shared a sonar image with Swedish media. Within days, international news outlets picked up the story. Headlines referred to it as a strange object, an underwater structure, and eventually the Baltic Sea Anomaly. The name stuck, even though it explained nothing. As public attention grew, so did speculation. But behind the headlines, the actual information was still limited. The only hard data available at that point came from sonar images and depth readings. No diver had seen the object directly. No physical samples had been taken. Everything depended on how the sonar data was interpreted. The Baltic Sea itself plays an important role in this mystery. Unlike most oceans, it has very low salinity. The water is cold and dark, and organic decay happens slowly. This is why wooden shipwrecks from the 1600s can remain almost perfectly preserved on the seafloor. It is also why geological features shaped by ice thousands of years ago can still look sharp and defined. Geologists were quick to point this out when asked about the anomaly. The Baltic region was covered by massive glaciers during the last ice age. As those glaciers moved, they carved, crushed, and dragged rocks across the seabed. When the ice retreated, it left behind unusual formations, including large boulders, ridges, and flat-top structures. Some experts suggested the object could be a glacial erratic, a large rock transported by ice and dropped in an unexpected place. Others proposed it might be a volcanic formation, although volcanic activity in the Baltic region is extremely limited and ancient. Ocean X did not claim to know what the object was. Lindbergh repeatedly stated that the team only reported what their instruments showed. Still, the shape continued to raise questions. The sonar image suggested edges that appeared almost straight. The top seemed flat, like a platform. These details fueled discussions about sunken structures and ancient ocean discoveries, even though no evidence supported human involvement. In August 2011, Ocean X returned to the site with better equipment and a remotely operated vehicle. This time they aimed to capture video footage and take samples from the surrounding seabed. Conditions were difficult. The depth was near the limit for safe diving, visibility was poor, and the water temperature hovered just above freezing. The footage they released later was brief and unclear. It showed a rocky surface covered in sediment. There were no visible markings, no inscriptions, and no obvious signs of construction. The rock appeared rough and uneven up close, unlike the smooth, symmetrical shape suggested by sonar. This only complicated the situation. Supporters of natural explanations pointed to the rough texture as proof that the anomaly was simply a rock formation. Others argued that erosion and sediment could hide details, especially after thousands of years underwater. Without clear images or samples, both sides lacked solid ground. One of the most concrete findings from that expedition was a small rock sample taken from the area. Tests showed it was made of granite and gneiss, common rocks in the region. This result supported the idea that the object could be natural. However, it did not explain the overall shape seen on sonar. As the months passed, funding became a major obstacle. Detailed underwater archaeology is expensive. Sending advanced submersibles, performing full scans, and conducting proper geological studies requires millions of dollars. Ocean X was a private team without government backing. Without new funding, further exploration stalled. By the end of 2011, the Baltic Sea anomaly had become a symbol of how modern technology can uncover mysteries faster than science can explain them. The data existed, but not enough of it. The interpretations varied, but none could be confirmed. Chapter 2. Yonaguni Monument. Yonaguni Island sits at the far western edge of Japan, closer to Taiwan than to Tokyo. It is a quiet place, known for strong currents, clear water, and steep underwater cliffs that drop quickly into deep blue. For most of history, the sea around Yonaguni was familiar only to local fishermen and divers. No ancient texts mentioned anything unusual beneath the waves. There were no legends of lost cities tied to this spot. What changed everything happened by accident. In 1986, a Japanese diver named Kiichiro Aratake was exploring the waters off Yonaguni while searching for hammerhead sharks. These sharks gather seasonally in the area, and divers often follow the currents along the rocky seafloor. As Aratake descended near the southern coast of the island, he noticed something that did not fit the natural landscape he knew well. Instead of irregular rocks and coral, he saw massive stone surfaces that looked flat, sharp, and stepped. What lay beneath him appeared enormous. Huge blocks of stone rose from the seabed, forming what looked like terraces and platforms. Some edges appeared almost straight. Other sections looked like stairways carved into the rock. The formation stretched across a wide area, far larger than a single rock outcrop. Aratake later said that the moment felt unsettling, not because it was frightening, but because it felt unexpected. The shapes looked deliberate. At first, the discovery spread slowly. Local divers visited the site and confirmed the basic features. The water depth was shallow enough, roughly 5 to 25 meters, that visibility was good on calm days. This allowed divers to swim along the surfaces and get a sense of scale. The structure, now known as the Yonaguni Monument, seemed to rise in layers, with sharp angles that stood out in contrast to the rounded coral reefs nearby. News of the site reached Masaki Kimura, a marine geologist from the University of the Ryukyus. Kimura began studying the formation in the late 1990s and would later become the most well-known researcher connected to Yonaguni. From the start, he believed the site deserved serious attention. He mapped the area, took measurements, and documented features that, in his view, could not be explained easily by natural erosion alone. Kimura described what he believed were steps, pillars, flat plazas, and even what appeared to be carved depressions. He noted right angles that seemed too precise to be random. Some surfaces looked smoothed, while others formed long, straight lines extending for several meters. To Kimura, these details suggested that the structure may have been modified by humans when sea levels were lower. This idea quickly brought Yonaguni into global conversations about lost underwater cities and submerged civilizations. During the last ice age, sea levels were much lower than they are today. Large areas of land that are now underwater were once exposed. If humans lived in the region during that time, it raised the possibility that coastal structures could now be submerged. However, not everyone agreed with Kimura's interpretation. Many geologists argued that the Yonaguni monument could be explained entirely through natural processes. The stone itself is sandstone and mudstone, materials known to fracture along straight plains. Over time, tectonic activity, earthquakes, and erosion can cause large slabs to break away, creating flat surfaces and sharp edges. The waters around Yonaguni are especially active. Strong currents, frequent earthquakes, and constant wave action shape the seafloor. Some geologists pointed out that similar stepped rock formations can be found on land, where erosion follows natural fault lines. Underwater, these effects can appear even more dramatic. As the debate grew, more divers, researchers, and filmmakers visited the site. High-quality underwater footage showed the massive scale of the structure. Divers swimming along the terraces looked small by comparison. The monument appeared to have multiple levels, with drops that resembled giant steps. This visual impact played a major role in why the site became one of the most famous unexplained ruins associated with underwater archaeology. Still, visuals alone could not solve the mystery. No tools, pottery, bones, or inscriptions have ever been recovered from the site. This absence of artifacts remains one of the strongest arguments against human construction. In known ancient cities, even submerged ones, physical evidence of human life is usually present. Supporters of partial human modification countered this by pointing out that Yonaguni would have been a coastal or shoreline site if it was ever above water. Waves, storms, and rising seas could have washed away lighter materials over thousands of years. Stone, they argue, is what would remain. Another point of discussion centered on nearby features. Smaller rock formations in the area also show sharp angles and flat faces. Critics argue this suggests a regional geological pattern rather than a unique man-made structure. Kimura acknowledged this, but maintained that some features at Yonaguni were distinct in scale and arrangement. By the early 2000s, Yonaguni had become a reference point in discussions about ancient ocean discoveries. It appeared in documentaries, books, and academic debates. Yet despite decades of attention, no final answer emerged. Japanese authorities did not classify the site as an archaeological ruin, largely due to the lack of definitive proof. What makes Yonaguni especially compelling is that it sits in a gray zone. It is undeniably real. Divers can touch it, measure it, and swim across it. At the same time, its origin resists simple explanation. Each explanation, natural or human-influenced, accounts for some features but not all. At this stage in the story, the focus shifts from discovery to interpretation. Understanding Yonaguni requires looking more closely at the science behind erosion, sea level change, and how researchers test claims of submerged civilizations. That deeper look helps explain why, after decades of study, the Yonaguni monument remains one of the most debated sunken structures in the world, and why its mystery continues without a clear conclusion. Chapter 3. The Lost City of Heracleion. For centuries, Heracleion existed in a strange place between history and legend. Ancient Greek writers mentioned it in passing, often describing it as a wealthy port city at the mouth of the Nile. They wrote about grand temples, busy harbors, and rituals honoring the gods. Yet no one could point to its location on a map. Over time, many scholars assumed Heracleion was either exaggerated or entirely mythical, a symbolic city rather than a real one. That belief began to change in the late 20th century, when underwater archaeology along Egypt's northern coast started revealing unexpected clues. Abu Qir Bay, east of Alexandria, had long been known as a difficult stretch of water. The sea is shallow, murky, and filled with thick layers of mud deposited by the Nile over thousands of years. Ancient ports were known to exist in the area, but much of the seafloor remained unexplored due to poor visibility and unstable sediment. In the 1990s, a team led by French marine archaeologist Frank Gaudiot began systematic surveys of the bay. Gaudiot had already gained recognition for locating shipwrecks and submerged sites using advanced sonar, magnetometers, and satellite positioning. His approach combined historical research with modern technology, focusing on areas described in ancient texts but never confirmed through archaeology. One of those texts came from the Greek historian Herodotus, who wrote in the 5th century BCE. He mentioned a city called Heraklion, known to the Egyptians as Thonis, located near the Canopic branch of the Nile. According to these accounts, the city served as a gateway between Egypt and the Greek world. All foreign ships entering Egypt were required to stop there. It was a place of trade, customs, and religious importance. For years, these references remained frustratingly vague. The Nile Delta has shifted constantly over time, with river branches drying up, changing course, or disappearing entirely. Entire cities were built on soft, waterlogged ground. As coastlines moved and sea levels slowly rose, some settlements were abandoned, while others simply vanished from view. In 2000, after years of scanning the seabed, Gaudiot's team detected large anomalies beneath the mud of Abu Qir Bay. Sonar images revealed shapes that did not belong to natural formations. There were straight lines, rectangular outlines, and clusters of objects spread across a wide area. When divers descended to investigate, they began uncovering massive stone blocks, statues, and the remains of buildings. What they found confirmed that Heraklion was real. Beneath several meters of sediment lay the remains of a vast city. Stone quays, harbor basins, and canals suggested a complex port system designed to handle heavy traffic. Colossal statues of gods and pharaohs lay toppled on the seafloor, some weighing several tons. Among them were representations of Hapi, the god of the Nile's annual flood, and a large statue believed to depict a Ptolemaic king. Perhaps most striking were the temple remains. Archaeologists identified a central sanctuary dedicated to Amun-Gareb, a local form of the god Amun. Ancient inscriptions matched descriptions from historical records, linking the submerged ruins directly to Heraklion Thonis. This was no small outpost. It had been a major religious and economic center. As more artifacts were recovered, the scale of the city became clearer. Over 700 anchors were found, pointing to intense maritime activity. Dozens of shipwrecks lay nearby, spanning different time periods. Gold coins, bronze tools, jewelry, and everyday objects painted a picture of a wealthy, active port that thrived for centuries. With the city's existence confirmed, attention shifted to a more troubling question. How did a place this important disappear so completely? Initial evidence suggested that Heraklion did not sink all at once. Instead, it appeared to have collapsed in stages. The city was built on layers of clay and silt deposited by the Nile. This ground was stable enough under normal conditions but extremely vulnerable to sudden changes. Geologists studying the site identified signs of soil liquefaction, a process where saturated ground temporarily loses strength during earthquakes or heavy stress. When this happens, solid land can behave like liquid. Buildings sink, tilt, or break apart. In coastal areas, this can be catastrophic. The Nile Delta is seismically active. Historical records describe earthquakes in the region during ancient times. Combined with rising sea levels and gradual subsidence, these tremors may have caused large sections of Heraklion to sink beneath the water. Evidence from the ruins supports this idea. Many structures appear to have collapsed inward, rather than being worn down by waves alone. Statues lie where they fell, not scattered by currents. Walls are broken but not eroded smooth, suggesting sudden destruction followed by burial under sediment. Still, the exact timeline remains unclear. Archaeological finds indicate that parts of the city were still in use as late as the 2nd century BCE. Other sections may have been abandoned earlier. There is no single written account describing the city's final days. No record of a great disaster that erased it overnight. This lack of clarity is what keeps Heraklion among the most compelling lost underwater cities ever discovered. Despite the richness of the finds, the moment when the city crossed the line from struggling port to submerged ruin remains difficult to pinpoint. By the time it vanished completely, the memory of Heraklion seems to have faded quickly. New ports rose nearby, including Alexandria, which became the dominant center of trade and power. As centuries passed, the sea reclaimed the delta, and mud sealed the city away. At this point in the story, the focus turns from discovery to disappearance. Understanding how Heracleion fell requires a closer look at the natural forces acting on the Nile Delta and how human settlement choices may have made the city vulnerable. That deeper context helps explain why such a powerful place could be lost to the sea and why parts of its story are still missing today. Chapter 4. The Antikythera Mechanism. In the spring of 1900, a group of sponge divers from the Greek island of Symi took shelter from a storm near a small, rocky island called Antikythera. The place sat quietly between Crete and mainland Greece, far from major ports. While waiting for the weather to clear, the divers decided to explore the seafloor, hoping to find sponges they could sell. What they found instead would slowly change how historians understand ancient technology. At a depth of about 45 meters, diver Elias Stadiatis came across something unexpected. Scattered across the seabed were bronze and marble statues, broken pottery, and the remains of a large wooden ship. When he surfaced, he reportedly spoke of dead bodies and horses on the ocean floor. At first, his words sounded confused, but it quickly became clear that he had stumbled onto an ancient shipwreck. The Greek government organized a recovery operation in 1900 and 1901, one of the earliest large-scale underwater archaeology efforts in history. Divers worked under dangerous conditions, using heavy suits and air hoses. Several were injured, and one diver died during the operation. Despite the risks, they recovered an extraordinary collection of artifacts. Statues of gods and athletes, finely crafted jewelry, glassware, and coins were brought to the surface. The ship was dated to around the 1st century BCE, likely a Roman cargo vessel transporting Greek art. Among the many objects recovered was a small, corroded lump of bronze and wood, broken into several fragments. At the time, it attracted little attention. It was cataloged and stored at the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, assumed to be part of a statue or a simple instrument. It would be more than 2 years before anyone realized this object was something entirely different. In 1902, archaeologist Valerios Stais examined the corroded fragments more closely. He noticed what appeared to be gear teeth embedded in the bronze. This was strange. Gears were not unknown in the ancient world, but they were thought to be rare and simple. The idea that a complex geared mechanism existed in ancient Greece seemed unlikely. At first, many scholars dismissed the object as a later intrusion into the wreck or misidentified it altogether. Some suggested it was an astrolabe from the medieval period, despite the shipwreck's much earlier date. Others thought the gears were decorative or unrelated fragments fused together by corrosion. For decades, the object sat in storage, quietly resisting easy explanation. The technology available at the time was not advanced enough to study its interior without damaging it. The Antikythera mechanism, as it would later be called, remained a curiosity rather than a breakthrough. That began to change in the 1950s, when historian of science Derek de Solla Price took a serious interest in the fragments. Price believed the device deserved careful study, not dismissal. Using early X-ray imaging, he began examining the interior structure of the mechanism. What he found surprised nearly everyone. Inside the corroded casing were dozens of interlocking bronze gears, arranged with precision. Some gears had over 200 teeth. Others were linked in ways that suggested calculated ratios, not random design. This was not a simple tool, it was a machine. By the 1970s, Price proposed that the Antikythera mechanism was an ancient astronomical calculator. According to his research, the gears were designed to track celestial cycles, including the movements of the sun and moon. The device may have predicted eclipses and marked important dates in ancient calendars. This idea was controversial but increasingly hard to ignore. Over time, more fragments were identified, bringing the total to over 80 pieces, though only a few contained gears. Inscriptions etched into the bronze plates hinted at instructions or labels, written in ancient Greek. These texts suggested the device was meant to be used, not merely displayed. The real breakthrough came in the early 2000s, when researchers applied modern imaging techniques to the fragments. High-resolution X-ray computed tomography allowed scientists to see inside the mechanism in unprecedented detail. They could rotate virtual models of the gears, count teeth accurately, and read inscriptions that had been hidden for centuries. What emerged was astonishing. The Antikythera mechanism was far more complex than anyone had imagined. It contained at least 30 bronze gears, arranged to model multiple astronomical cycles. One set of gears tracked the Metonic cycle, a 19-year period used to align lunar and solar calendars. Another modeled the Saros cycle, which predicts eclipses. There were even indications that the device displayed the irregular motion of the moon, accounting for changes in its speed. In effect, this was a hand-powered machine capable of predicting celestial events with remarkable accuracy. Some researchers described it as the world's first analog computer. Others preferred more cautious language, but all agreed on one point: nothing else like it was known from the ancient world. And that is where the mystery deepens. The Antikythera mechanism did not fit neatly into existing timelines of technological history. Comparable gear-based machines did not appear again until medieval Europe, more than 1,000 years later. There were no known workshops, manuals, or similar devices to place it within a broader tradition of ancient engineering. Who built it remains uncertain. Some scholars suggest a connection to the school of Archimedes, who lived in the 3rd century BCE and wrote about complex mechanical devices. Others point to the island of Rhodes, a center of astronomy and engineering in the ancient Greek world. The ship itself may have been transporting the mechanism as a valuable scientific instrument, possibly destined for a wealthy Roman patron. Yet no matter where it came from, one question remains unresolved. If ancient engineers could build something this advanced, why has no other example survived? Why does this device appear alone in the archaeological record? As research continues, the Antikythera mechanism stands as both a triumph of ancient craftsmanship and a deep-sea mystery tied to a single shipwreck. Understanding its purpose is only part of the story. Understanding how such knowledge emerged, spread, and then seemingly vanished is a much harder problem, and one that requires looking beyond the device itself. Chapter 5. The Black Sea. Deluge. For most of human history, the Black Sea has felt ancient and enclosed, bordered by mountains, plains, and narrow passages that connect it to the wider ocean. Today, it is one of the largest inland seas in the world, but thousands of years ago, it may have been something very different. According to one scientific theory, the Black Sea was once a freshwater lake, surrounded by early human settlements, until a sudden and powerful flood changed it forever. The idea first gained wide attention in the late 1990s, when geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman from Columbia University published research based on seafloor data, sediment cores, and ancient shorelines. Their proposal was bold but grounded in measurable evidence. They suggested that around 7,600 years ago, rising sea levels caused Mediterranean waters to break through a natural barrier at what is now the Bosphorus Strait. When that barrier failed, salt water rushed into the Black Sea basin. At the time, global sea levels were still rising after the last ice age. Massive ice sheets had melted, releasing enormous volumes of water into the world's oceans. Coastlines everywhere were changing, often slowly, sometimes dramatically. The Black Sea region sat at a critical point, separated from the Mediterranean by land that was not much higher than the surrounding water. Ryan and Pittman argued that once Mediterranean waters overtopped this barrier, the flow would not have been gentle. Instead, water may have poured in with tremendous force, raising the Black Sea's level by several centimeters per day. Over months or years, shorelines would have retreated rapidly, swallowing fields, homes, and entire settlements. To support this theory, researchers looked beneath the Black Sea itself. Modern sonar surveys revealed ancient shorelines now submerged deep underwater. These shorelines sit far below today's sea level, suggesting that they were formed when the water was much lower. In some areas, these features appear sharp and well-defined, not slowly eroded, which hints at a relatively rapid change. Sediment cores taken from the seafloor added another piece to the puzzle. Beneath layers of salty marine sediment, scientists found freshwater deposits, including shells from species that cannot survive in saltwater. Above them were marine shells, indicating a sudden shift in conditions. This sharp boundary between freshwater and saltwater layers became one of the strongest pieces of evidence for a major flooding event. The Black Sea itself also has a unique feature that makes such ancient evidence easier to preserve. Its deeper waters are largely anoxic, meaning they contain very little oxygen. This prevents many organisms from breaking down organic material. As a result, shipwrecks, plant matter, and even ancient shorelines can remain remarkably intact for thousands of years. This makes the Black Sea a key location for underwater archaeology and ancient ocean discoveries. As the theory gained attention, researchers began looking for signs of human presence along those submerged shorelines. Early farming communities were known to live in the region during the proposed time period. They relied on fertile land, rivers, and predictable seasons. A sudden rise in water would have been devastating. Underwater surveys near the Black Sea coast have identified possible structures, including what appear to be stone alignments and drowned river valleys. Some researchers interpret these as signs of former human activity, such as docks or simple shoreline constructions. Others caution that natural processes can produce similar shapes, especially in sediment-heavy environments. This is where the mystery becomes more complex. While geological evidence strongly suggests a major environmental change, linking that change directly to human settlements is far more difficult. Organic materials decay, wooden structures collapse, and stone can shift over time. Clear proof of drowned villages is hard to come by. Still, the timing of the proposed flood overlaps with the spread of early agriculture across Europe and the Near East. This connection led some scholars to wonder whether displaced populations from the Black Sea region may have carried stories of a great flood with them. Over generations, these stories could have evolved into the flood myths found in many ancient cultures. Stories of a world-covering flood appear in Mesopotamian texts like the Epic of Gilgamesh, as well as later religious traditions. Ryan and Pittman were careful to say that geology does not prove these stories are literal records. Instead, they suggested that a real, traumatic event could have inspired oral traditions that later took on symbolic meaning. Not all scientists agree with the scale or speed of the Black Sea deluge. Some researchers argue that the water exchange between the Mediterranean and Black Sea may have been slower, occurring over centuries rather than years. Others point out that rising sea levels alone could explain many of the submerged features without requiring a sudden catastrophe. Additional studies have produced mixed results. Some sediment cores support a rapid transition, while others suggest a more gradual change. Computer models of water flow through the Bosphorus produce different outcomes depending on assumptions about sea level, land elevation, and erosion rates. What remains clear is that the Black Sea underwent a dramatic transformation in ancient times. Whether it happened as a violent flood or a steady encroachment of water is still debated. The physical evidence exists, but it does not tell a single, simple story. At this point, understanding the Black Sea deluge requires stepping back and examining how scientists test these theories, what newer underwater surveys have revealed, and why agreement has been so difficult to reach. That deeper look helps explain why this event remains one of the most discussed and unresolved ancient mysteries connected to submerged civilizations. Chapter 6. The Bimini Road. In the shallow waters near North Bimini Island, the sea is often calm enough that the sandy bottom is visible from the surface. Coral heads dot the seafloor, and schools of fish move easily through the clear water. It was here in 1968 that a pilot named J. Manson Valentine noticed something unusual while flying over the area. Just beneath the surface, he saw a long, straight line that did not look like a natural reef or sandbar. Curious, he returned with divers to investigate. What they found became known as the Bimini Road. Running roughly parallel to the shoreline, about 800 meters offshore, was a line of large stone blocks stretching for nearly half a mile. The stones were rectangular, some measuring several meters across, and they appeared to be laid end to end in a single file arrangement. In places, smaller stones seemed to sit beneath larger ones, giving the impression of intentional placement. The formation rested in shallow water, typically less than 6 meters deep, making it easy for divers to explore. At first glance, the structure looked almost like an ancient causeway or harbor wall. Its straight alignment stood out sharply against the surrounding seabed. For those who saw it for the first time, it was hard not to think of human involvement. The idea that this could be an unexplained ruin or a remnant of a lost underwater city quickly took hold. The timing of the discovery played a role in how it was received. Just a few decades earlier, the psychic Edgar Cayce had made famous predictions about a lost civilization called Atlantis, claiming parts of it would be found near Bimini in the late 1960s. When the Bimini Road was discovered in 1968, many people saw it as a fulfillment of that prediction. Media attention followed, and the site became one of the most talked about sunken structures in the world. Divers began visiting the area regularly. Some reported seeing right angles and stones that appeared fitted together. Others pointed out gaps and irregularities that suggested natural movement over time. Photographs and early underwater footage circulated widely, often framed as evidence of advanced ancient engineering. As interest grew, scientists stepped in to examine the formation more closely. Geologists from universities in the United States and the Caribbean began studying the stones themselves. What they found shifted the conversation in a different direction. The blocks were identified as beach rock, a type of limestone that forms naturally along coastlines in tropical regions. Beach rock develops when sand, shells, and other debris become cemented together by calcium carbonate. This process can happen relatively quickly in warm, shallow waters. Over time, large slabs can break away along natural fracture lines, often forming rectangular shapes. According to this explanation, the Bimini Road is not a road at all, but the eroded remains of an ancient shoreline. When sea levels were lower thousands of years ago, this rock would have formed along the coast. As the sea rose, the shoreline submerged, and wave action caused the rock to crack and collapse outward, creating the linear pattern seen today. This theory gained support through radiocarbon dating. Samples taken from the beach rock suggested ages ranging from 2,000 to 3,500 years old, far younger than the timeline proposed for Atlantis or other ancient civilizations capable of large-scale stone construction. These dates place the formation well within a period when no known advanced stone-building cultures existed in the Bahamas. Still, the debate did not end there. Supporters of a human-made explanation argued that beach rock alone could not account for the alignment and stacking seen in some areas. They pointed to sections where stones appear to sit on top of one another, rather than simply lying flat. Others noted that the formation curves gently, maintaining a consistent orientation that feels intentional. Underwater archaeology teams conducted detailed surveys, mapping the stones and examining their relationships. Some concluded that while individual blocks look artificial, the overall formation lacks key features of human construction. There are no tool marks, no cut surfaces, and no associated artifacts such as pottery or tools. Without those elements, it is difficult to classify the site as a submerged civilization or ancient structure. What complicates the picture is how deceptive underwater environments can be. Light bends, distances appear shorter, and familiar shapes can feel unfamiliar. A straight line underwater can seem more striking than it would on land. Natural fractures can resemble careful design, especially when viewed through the lens of expectation. The Bimini Road sits at the intersection of geology and imagination. It is real, measurable, and accessible, yet open to interpretation. Unlike deeper deep-sea mystery sites, this one can be visited by recreational divers, which has only increased public fascination. Photos taken from different angles can support very different conclusions. Over the years, additional nearby formations have been documented. Some are more chaotic, others vaguely linear. Geologists argue that these variations support a natural origin, showing different stages of erosion and collapse. Critics counter that human-built structures can also degrade unevenly over time. What remains missing is decisive evidence. No settlement has been found nearby. No tools or carvings link the stones to human hands. At the same time, the formation's location and shape continue to feel unusual, even to seasoned researchers. By the early 2000s, most academic institutions leaned toward the beach rock explanation. The Bimini Road was largely classified as a natural feature, though often with a note acknowledging its unusual appearance. Outside academic circles, however, interest never faded. The site continues to appear in discussions about lost underwater cities and unexplained ruins. To understand why this debate has lasted so long, it helps to look more closely at how scientists study beach rock, how sea levels change around the Bahamas, and what underwater archaeology can and cannot prove. That closer examination brings important context to the mystery and helps explain why the Bimini Road still sits in a gray area, resisting a final answer. Chapter 7. The disappearance of the USS Cyclops. In early March of 1918, the Atlantic Ocean was crowded with wartime traffic. World War I was still raging in Europe, and ships moved constantly between the Americas and the battle zones overseas. Among them was the USS Cyclops, a massive U.S. Navy cargo ship nearly 550 feet long. Built to carry coal and heavy supplies, she was one of the largest vessels in the Navy at the time. Nothing about her final voyage suggested she was heading toward disaster. The Cyclops had been commissioned in 1910 and spent much of her service hauling fuel and materials. By 1918, her role had expanded. She was tasked with transporting manganese ore, a critical material used to harden steel for weapons and ships. On January 9, 1918, the Cyclops left Norfolk, Virginia, bound for Rio de Janeiro. On board were 309 people, including crew members and passengers. That number alone would later make her disappearance especially devastating. The trip south was not entirely smooth. Reports from the crew indicated that one of the ship's engines was not functioning properly. The Cyclops was designed to operate with 2 engines, but during this voyage, she was running on only one. This reduced speed and maneuverability, though it was not considered dangerous enough to cancel the mission. Ships often sailed with mechanical issues during wartime due to urgent demands. After reaching Rio de Janeiro in early February, the ship loaded over 10,000 tons of manganese ore. The cargo was extremely heavy, and some later investigators would question whether it was loaded evenly. An uneven load could place stress on the ship's hull, especially in rough seas. At the time, however, no official report suggested that the cargo posed an immediate threat. On February 16, 1918, the Cyclops departed Rio and headed north. Her next planned stop was Baltimore, Maryland. On February 20th, she arrived in Barbados to refuel and inspect her engines. This would be the last confirmed location of the ship. While in Barbados, Captain George Worley sent a routine message to the Navy. It contained no distress signals, no warnings, and no mention of serious trouble. He reported that the ship was taking on fuel and would soon continue toward Baltimore. Weather reports from the region described fair conditions, with no major storms recorded along the expected route. Sometime after leaving Barbados, the Cyclops vanished. She did not arrive in Baltimore as scheduled. Days passed, then weeks. No radio messages were received. No wreckage washed ashore. No lifeboats were found drifting at sea. As concern grew, the U.S. Navy began searching shipping lanes along the East Coast and throughout the Caribbean. Nothing turned up. By April 1918, the Navy officially declared the ship lost. It was the largest single loss of life in U.S. naval history, not caused by combat. Families were left with no answers, only silence. What made the disappearance especially troubling was the complete lack of evidence. Ships sink for many reasons, but they usually leave something behind. Floating debris, oil slicks, distress calls, or survivor accounts often help piece together what happened. In the case of the Cyclops, there was nothing. It was as if the ship had simply been erased. Early theories focused on mechanical failure. With only one engine operational, the ship may have struggled in heavy seas. If the cargo shifted suddenly, it could have caused the vessel to list or even break apart. Manganese ore is dense and unforgiving. A sudden shift could stress the hull beyond its limits. Others pointed to structural concerns. The Cyclops was part of a class of ships that would later gain a troubling reputation. 2 of her sister ships, the USS Proteus and USS Nereus, both disappeared under similar circumstances in 1941, also while carrying heavy cargo and also without leaving wreckage. This raised questions about design flaws that may not have been fully understood at the time. There were also suspicions surrounding Captain Worley himself. He was known to be strict and sometimes unpopular with his crew. Some accounts described him as dismissive of safety concerns. While there is no solid evidence of wrongdoing, these stories added tension to an already unsettling case. Because the disappearance occurred during wartime, other explanations emerged. Some suggested the ship may have been sunk by a German submarine. German U-boats were active in the Atlantic at the time, and several ships were lost to enemy action. However, no German records indicate an attack on a ship matching the Cyclops' description in that area. No distress call was intercepted, and no explosion was reported by other vessels. The ship's route also passed through an area that would later become associated with unexplained maritime incidents, often referred to as the Bermuda Triangle. While this label did not exist in 1918, later writers would link the Cyclops to that region. The Navy, however, has consistently rejected any supernatural explanation, emphasizing the lack of evidence for such claims. By the end of the initial investigation, the Navy reached a frustrating conclusion. The cause of the loss was unknown. In an official report, they stated that the ship was overdue and presumed lost, and that no satisfactory explanation could be determined. At this point in the story, the Cyclops exists as a question mark in naval history. To understand why her disappearance remains unresolved more than a century later, it becomes important to look closer at the investigations that followed, the later loss of her sister ships, and how the absence of physical evidence has shaped every theory since. Chapter 8. The Gulf of Cambay Structures. In the early 2000s, India's western coastline became the center of a quiet but intense debate about ancient ocean discoveries. The area in question lay in the Gulf of Cambay, also known as the Gulf of Cambay, a wide inlet of the Arabian Sea bordered by the modern cities of Gujarat. This region has long been shaped by powerful tides, thick sediment, and fast-moving currents that make underwater exploration especially difficult. For that reason, much of the seafloor there had remained largely unmapped. That changed in 2001, when India's National Institute of Ocean Technology began conducting sonar surveys as part of an environmental and geological study. The goal was not to find lost underwater cities or unexplained ruins. Researchers were studying pollution patterns, sediment movement, and seabed features related to coastal development. As the sonar data came in, however, analysts noticed something unexpected. Beneath layers of mud and shifting sand, the sonar images showed large, geometric-looking features spread across a wide area. Some appeared linear, others seemed rectangular. The formations were located at depths of around 30 to 40 meters and extended for several kilometers. To researchers reviewing the scans, the shapes did not immediately resemble natural rock outcrops. The findings were publicly announced in 2002, and the reaction was immediate. Indian media reports described the discovery as evidence of a possible ancient submerged civilization. Some headlines suggested the structures could be more than 9,000 years old, potentially older than known urban centers in Mesopotamia or the Indus Valley. The idea that a lost city might lie beneath the Gulf of Cambay captured widespread attention. Researchers involved in the project emphasized that the sonar data alone could not confirm human construction. Still, the patterns were intriguing enough to justify further investigation. Follow-up missions were launched using dredging equipment and remote sampling tools, since diving in the Gulf's strong currents is extremely dangerous. During these efforts, several artifacts were reportedly recovered from the seabed. These included pieces of pottery, stone tools, beads, and fragments of what some described as worked stone. One piece of wood was carbon dated to around 7,500 BCE, a result that added fuel to the controversy. If the dating was accurate and the material came from the same context as the structures, it would suggest human activity far earlier than expected. This is where the debate became sharply divided. Supporters of the submerged civilization theory argued that the sonar patterns, combined with the artifacts, pointed toward a large settlement that had been drowned by rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age. They noted that global sea levels were significantly lower during that period, exposing vast coastal plains that are now underwater. Early human communities often settled near rivers and shorelines, making the Gulf of Cambay a plausible location. They also pointed to ancient Indian texts that describe cities lost to the sea, though these references are symbolic and not tied to specific locations. Still, for some, the idea that advanced settlements once existed along India's submerged coast felt consistent with both geological history and cultural memory. Critics, however, raised serious concerns about the interpretation of the data. Geologists pointed out that sonar images can be misleading, especially in areas with heavy sediment flow. The Gulf's tides are among the strongest in the world, constantly reshaping the seabed. Natural features such as sand waves, buried river channels, and eroded rock formations can appear geometric when viewed through sonar. The artifacts themselves became a major point of contention. Skeptics argued that dredging is a blunt tool. It disturbs wide areas of the seabed and can mix materials from different time periods and locations. Without careful, controlled excavation, it is difficult to prove that the recovered objects were originally associated with the sonar-detected structures. In other words, a piece of ancient pottery found in the Gulf does not necessarily mean it came from a submerged city. It could have been carried by rivers, tides, or even shipwrecks over thousands of years. The carbon-dated wood sample also drew scrutiny. Some researchers questioned whether the sample had been contaminated or whether it truly originated from a structural context. Others noted that ancient wood could exist naturally in submerged riverbeds without indicating human construction. As the debate continued, one major limitation became impossible to ignore. There was no clear visual documentation of the structures themselves. No diver footage showed walls, streets, or buildings. No remotely operated vehicle produced images that could clearly distinguish between natural and artificial forms. Everything depended on sonar interpretations and indirect sampling. This lack of direct evidence made it difficult for the broader archaeological community to accept strong claims. Underwater archaeology relies heavily on context. Objects must be studied where they are found, in relation to surrounding features. In the Gulf of Cambay, that context remained elusive. Despite the controversy, the site remains one of the most discussed examples of disputed sunken structures in the world. It sits at the crossroads of geology, archaeology, and national interest. For India, the possibility of such an ancient submerged civilization carries deep cultural significance. For scientists, it presents a reminder of how challenging underwater research can be in extreme environments. At this stage, the story of the Gulf of Cambay is not about proving one side right or wrong. It is about understanding why certainty has been so hard to achieve. To move closer to answers, it becomes necessary to look at the region's geological history, the limits of current technology, and why follow-up research has been so limited in the years since the initial discovery. Chapter 9: The Lost Submarine. USS Scorpion. In the spring of 1968, the USS Scorpion was nearing the end of a long, intense deployment. She was a nuclear-powered attack submarine, part of the United States Navy's fast attack fleet during the height of the Cold War. Built to hunt enemy submarines and gather intelligence, the Scorpion operated quietly beneath the Atlantic, far from public attention. By late May, she was expected to return home. The submarine had left Norfolk, Virginia, months earlier, and spent much of her deployment tracking Soviet naval activity in the Mediterranean and Atlantic. These missions were routine but stressful. Crews worked long hours in confined spaces, surrounded by complex machinery and constant secrecy. By the time the Scorpion turned west toward the United States, both the vessel and her crew were tired. On May 21, 1968, the Scorpion sent her final message. It was brief and ordinary. The submarine reported its position southwest of the Azores and confirmed it was proceeding toward Norfolk. There was no distress signal, no indication of trouble, and no request for assistance. According to Navy records, everything appeared normal. Then silence. When the Scorpion failed to arrive on schedule, concern spread quickly through Naval Command. Submarines are designed to operate unseen, but they follow strict communication and movement plans. When one does not check in, alarms are raised. Search efforts began quietly at first, then expanded as days passed with no contact. The Cold War context added urgency. Nuclear submarines were among the most sensitive military assets in existence. Losing one without explanation was not only a human tragedy, but a strategic nightmare. The Scorpion carried nuclear weapons, and her reactor alone posed serious concerns if damaged on the seafloor. The U.S. Navy launched one of the most extensive underwater searches ever attempted. Using sonar arrays, listening stations, and data from underwater sound surveillance systems, analysts began reconstructing the submarine's final hours. These systems, originally designed to detect enemy submarines, picked up unusual acoustic signals in the Atlantic around the time the Scorpion disappeared. By analyzing these recordings, researchers narrowed the likely area of loss to a remote section of the ocean floor, roughly 740 kilometers southwest of the Azores. The depth was extreme, more than 3,000 meters. This was not a place divers could reach. Any investigation would rely on deep-sea technology. Months later, in October 1968, the wreck of the USS Scorpion was found. Using the deep-sea submersible Trieste II and advanced camera systems, the Navy located the submarine broken into several large sections on the seabed. The images confirmed the worst. All 99 crew members had been lost. Finding the wreck answered one question, but raised many more. The submarine was heavily damaged. The bow section appeared crushed. Debris was scattered across the seafloor. Some sections suggested a violent implosion, the kind that happens when a submarine exceeds its crush depth. However, what caused the Scorpion to descend uncontrollably remained unclear. Official Navy investigations leaned toward mechanical failure. One leading theory suggested a malfunction in the submarine's torpedo systems. The Scorpion carried Mark 37 torpedoes, some of which used experimental battery technology. There were concerns at the time about overheating and instability. Investigators proposed that a torpedo may have activated accidentally, causing an internal explosion or forcing the crew to attempt emergency procedures. Another theory focused on the submarine's condition before departure. Unlike some other vessels, the Scorpion had not received a full overhaul prior to deployment. Maintenance reports noted mechanical issues, including problems with emergency systems. While none were considered immediately dangerous, critics later argued that these issues may have compounded under stress. Despite these explanations, doubts persisted. Some acoustic data suggested multiple explosive events rather than a single failure. Other analysts questioned whether the damage pattern matched a torpedo accident. The Navy released summaries of its findings, but many details remained classified. Outside official channels, alternative explanations began to circulate. Some speculated about a possible collision with another vessel or even an encounter with a Soviet submarine. During the Cold War, both sides closely monitored each other's movements. Encounters beneath the surface were rare but not impossible. The Navy has consistently denied any evidence of enemy involvement. No Soviet records have ever confirmed an engagement, and no damage consistent with a collision was identified. Still, the lack of complete transparency has left room for questions to linger. What makes the Scorpion especially haunting among deep-sea mystery cases is that it is both found and unexplained. The wreck is known, the location is mapped, and yet the precise chain of events that led to her loss remains uncertain. Each theory answers some questions, but leaves others unresolved. As years passed, additional studies were conducted, including environmental monitoring to ensure no radioactive leakage from the reactor. These studies showed minimal impact, offering some reassurance, but they did nothing to clarify why the submarine went down. To understand why the mystery persists, it helps to look more closely at the evidence recovered from the wreck, the disagreements among investigators, and the classified nature of Cold War naval operations. That deeper examination reveals why, even with the submarine located, the story of the USS Scorpion is still unfinished. Chapter 10. The Sunken City of Pavlopetri. Just off the southern coast of Greece, near the small village of Elefonisos, the water looks calm and ordinary. Fishing boats drift by. Swimmers move through clear, shallow waves. Nothing on the surface suggests that an entire city is resting below. But only a few meters down, spread across the sandy seafloor, lies Pavlopetri, the oldest known submerged city ever discovered. Unlike many underwater ruins found by accident or rumor, Pavlopetri is real, mapped, and studied in detail. Streets, buildings, courtyards, and even a harbor layout can still be traced beneath the water. It is not a single structure or scattered stones. It is a full city plan, frozen in place and quietly preserved by the sea. The story of Pavlopetri begins in 1967, when a British marine geologist named Nicholas Fleming noticed unusual stone formations while surveying the coast. At first glance, they did not look natural. The shapes were too straight, too organized. Walls appeared to form right angles. Pathways seemed intentional. Fleming realized he was looking at something far older than a shipwreck. Further investigation confirmed his suspicions. What lay underwater was an ancient settlement, later named Pavlopetri after the nearby shore. Early studies suggested the city dated back at least 3,500 years, placing it in the Bronze Age. Later research pushed that date even further, possibly as early as 2,800 BCE. What makes Pavlopetri stand out among lost underwater cities is how complete it is. Many submerged sites consist of broken temples or collapsed ports. Pavlopetri, by contrast, preserves an entire urban layout. Archaeologists have identified streets running between houses, clusters of rooms, courtyards, staircases, and tombs. There is even evidence of a sophisticated harbor system, suggesting the city was once an active center of trade. For a long time, studying Pavlopetri was difficult. Traditional underwater archaeology relies on divers sketching what they see, a slow and imprecise process. But in the early 2000s, new technology changed everything. Researchers from the University of Nottingham used advanced sonar and 3D mapping tools to scan the site in extraordinary detail. These scans produced a digital reconstruction of the city, allowing researchers to walk its streets virtually. For the first time, Pavlopetri could be studied as a whole, not just as fragments. This marked a major moment in underwater archaeology and ancient ocean discoveries. The digital maps revealed just how carefully planned the city was. Buildings were arranged in blocks. Roads were wide enough for foot traffic and transport. Some structures appeared larger and more complex, possibly public or administrative buildings. Others were clearly homes, complete with multiple rooms and storage areas. This level of organization suggests Pavlopetri was not a small fishing village. It was likely a thriving coastal city connected to trade networks across the Aegean Sea. Pottery found in the area links it to the Minoan and Mycenaean cultures, powerful civilizations that dominated the region during the Bronze Age. And yet, despite all this detail, one question remains unanswered. Why did Pavlopetri sink? Geologists and archaeologists agree that the city did not collapse overnight due to a single event. The region sits near active fault lines, and earthquakes have shaped the Greek coastline for thousands of years. Evidence suggests Pavlopetri may have been damaged by repeated seismic activity, each quake weakening structures and altering the shoreline. Sea level rise also played a role. Over centuries, gradual changes in sea level would have pushed water closer to the city. What was once a safe harbor may have become increasingly unstable. Eventually, the land subsided enough for the sea to reclaim the settlement entirely. Still, the speed of the abandonment is unclear. There are no signs that the city was rebuilt or reoccupied nearby. No later structures appear on top of the ruins. This suggests that once Pavlopetri was lost, it was lost for good. That raises another mystery. Why didn't the people return? In ancient time, cities were often rebuilt after disasters. Earthquakes, floods, even invasions did not always mean permanent abandonment. Yet Pavlopetri seems to have been left behind completely. Some researchers believe the damage may have been too extensive, or that trade routes shifted, making the location less valuable. Others point to broader regional changes. The collapse of Bronze Age civilizations around 1200 BCE affected much of the eastern Mediterranean. Economic systems failed, populations moved, cities disappeared. Pavlopetri may have been one of many casualties of this wider breakdown. What makes the mystery linger is how well the city was preserved. Streets are still visible. Walls remain in place. It feels less like ruins and more like a paused moment in time. A functioning city, quietly submerged, never adapted, never replaced. Today, Pavlopetri is protected by Greek law. Divers are not allowed to disturb the site, and ongoing research focuses on preservation rather than excavation. The city rests in shallow water, vulnerable to erosion, anchors, and climate change, yet still remarkably intact. Pavlopetri challenges how we think about ancient civilizations and submerged cities. It shows that complex urban life existed along coastlines far earlier than once believed. It also reminds us that the sea does not just hide myths or legends. Sometimes it preserves real places, with real people behind them, whose final moments remain unknown. In the next part, we'll take a closer look at the people who lived in Pavlopetri, how daily life may have unfolded there, and what the city tells us about early coastal civilizations before the sea quietly took it away.